Tonight, before we follow kings into stone cities and watch old calendars turn beneath the stars, it helps to begin in the quietest possible way. Imagine the first light of morning gathering above a deep green canopy. The air is cool, mist drifts between trunks that have been standing longer than memory. Somewhere in that wide breathing forest, a staircase of ancient stone rises into view, softened by moss, worn by rain, and half hidden by leaves that never stop returning. For a long time, the world looked at places like this and thought only of disappearance. It saw ruins and assumed silence. It saw roots running over carved faces and believed that a people had simply fallen away, as if history could be swallowed whole by vines. But the older you grow in the company of such places, the less convincing that idea becomes. Stone does not vanish easily, and neither does memory. A carved date on a monument still holds its shape. A pattern placed on a temple wall still catches light in the same way. A name once spoken in a royal court can still be traced, slowly, by careful hand. And beyond the old sites, beyond the tourist paths and scholarly maps, there are villages, towns, market roads, schools, kitchens, farms, and ceremonies where descendants still wake each morning inside traditions that are not dead at all. The story that many outsiders once treated as finished never actually came to an end. It changed forms. It moved from one kind of house to another. It learned how to survive in quieter rooms. That is what makes the Maya world so deeply suited to a night like this. It is full of greatness, yes, but it is also full of return. Seasons return, rain returns, dry heat returns, corn returns, the count of days returns. Even when cities fail, and because of that, this is not only a story of splendor or collapse, it is a story of continuance. It is a story about what happens when knowledge is carried not by machines or empires, but by people who keep planting, keep speaking, keep remembering, and keep teaching children how to stand inside a long inheritance without needing to announce it loudly. So we will not rush. We will not begin with conquest or crisis or the tallest pyramid in the forest. We will go more slowly than that. We will enter through air, water, soil, and the patient rhythm of ordinary survival. We will let this world arrive piece by piece, the way dawn arrives in the rainforest, almost too gently to notice at first. And by the time the great cities appear, by the time the astronomers begin marking the sky and the rulers begin clothing themselves in the language of gods, you will already be somewhere deeper. You will already understand that beneath every monument there was a field. Beneath every field there was a season, and beneath every season there was the human wish to remain. If you stay in that feeling for a moment, the forest becomes less like scenery and more like a companion. The leaves are not only surrounding the old stones, they are protecting a tempo, they are slowing the eye, they are asking you to let the world become wider and softer at the same time. History often reaches us through noise, through claims, through dates pushed forward like sharp objects. But tonight, it can move another way. Tonight it can move like damp wind through branches, like footsteps on a path that has been used for longer than any one lifetime can hold. And once the pace has softened, once the air has changed, we can begin at the beginning that mattered most. Not with a throne, not with a war, not with a monument reaching toward the clouds. We can begin with a seed, long before royal names were carved into pillars, before processions climbed temple steps, before scribes painted black lines across bark paper, there were people learning how to live with a difficult plant. It did not yet resemble the full ears of corn that later generations would know. It was rougher, smaller, less generous, a grass that would have seemed unpromising to anyone unwilling to wait. But waiting was exactly what ancient communities in Mesoamerica learned to do. They noticed, they selected, they kept certain seeds and discarded others, they planted again. They watched which stalks held up better, which kernels grew fuller, which harvests repaid patience with a little more abundance than the last. This was not a single discovery made in a single afternoon. It was one of those transformations that only becomes visible across generations. A grandmother might not live to see what a great-grandchild would call normal. Yet each season added something to the process. Hands learned the plant. Fields slowly adapted to human need, and human life slowly adapted in return. Out of that long partnership came more than food. Out of it came the possibility of staying. That is one of the quiet miracles at the center of this story. Once a reliable crop begins to anchor life, the world changes shape. Movement becomes more selective. A camp becomes a place visited again. A place visited again becomes familiar ground. Familiar ground becomes a settlement. A settlement gathers memory. Paths harden between houses. Children grow up knowing where the good shade falls in late afternoon, and where water can be found when the dry months stretch too long. In a world that had once required more wandering, corn offered another kind of time. It offered repeated return. You can almost feel the emotional difference. A life built entirely around pursuit and season has one texture. A life that begins to circle around planted earth has another. The hearth becomes steadier, storage matters more, neighbors matter more, families do not simply travel together. They inherit nearby land, share labor, and begin to think in terms of the days. Next rainy season as something to prepare for collectively. That kind of living does not yet produce great cities, but it contains the first promise of them. And it does something else as well. It changes the meaning of the landscape. Hills are no longer only obstacles or lookouts. They become references. Wetlands are no longer merely places to avoid. They become environments to understand. Soil types matter. Seasonal flooding matters. The behavior of shade trees matters. So does the movement of birds and the taste of water from different sources. Agriculture makes people more observant, not less. It ties survival to a finer reading of place in the Maya world. That reading would eventually become extraordinarily subtle. But even in these early stages, the pattern was already forming. A field was never just a field. It was a conversation with rainfall, slope, insects, roots, and time. It demanded patience, and patience trained the senses. Every year of planting deepened memory. Every harvest carried a lesson forward. It is difficult to build anything enduring without that kind of repetition behind it. So when later ages looked back and told stories of a people of builders, astronomers and kings, they were looking at the visible crest of something much older. The foundation was agricultural intimacy. The foundation was the willingness to notice what changed slowly. The foundation was a relationship between human attention and the gradual shaping of maize into a crop capable of supporting settled life across generations. If there is comfort in that thought, it comes from how ordinary it is. Civilizations often sound distant when told through the voices of rulers. They feel closer when you remember that someone had to kneel in the dirt, save seed, clear brush, and trust the next season enough to prepare for it. Long before anyone measured the heavens with precision, there were hands brushing soil away from roots. Long before a city dominated the horizon, there were families waiting for green shoots to rise. Corn also changed spiritual imagination. When a people depend upon a crop so completely, the crop ceases to be only nutrition. It becomes character, metaphor, ancestry, and moral instruction. To plant is to rehearse trust. To weed is to practice care. To harvest is to acknowledge a relationship that cannot be taken for granted. Later, Maya traditions would connect human life to maize in ways both poetic and sacred. And that development makes deep emotional sense. What feeds the body long enough eventually feeds the imagination as well. So, if you want the softest possible doorway into this civilization, you could do worse than to picture a field after rain. Soil darkened, leaves newly washed, the scent of damp earth lifting into the air, and people stepping carefully between rows that promise another season of staying. That image contains the future in miniature. Temples, calendars, courts, trade, all of it rests there in seed form. And once they did, once food could be counted on more often, the first settled communities began to gather their own rhythm. The change was gradual. It would have looked modest from within. A few structures, cleared plots, storage spaces, repeated movement between home and field. Yet history often turns most decisively in places that do not look dramatic at all. A village can begin so quietly that no one living inside it would dream that thousands of years later, strangers would speak of it as a beginning. Still, that is what it was. The earliest villages were not grand. They did not need to be. Their importance lay in the fact that people returned to them, improved them, and remembered them. Roofs of thatch, walls of practical materials, cooking places, sleeping places, working spaces. Nearby, plots of land that could be tended in succession. A village is one of the gentlest technologies human beings ever invented. It arranges closeness. It teaches repetition. It gives shape to the day. In such places, life would have felt both fragile and familiar. Food had to be secured, tools had to be made and repaired, game still mattered, wild plants still mattered, weather could still threaten everything. But the balance between movement and rootedness had shifted. Families were now building more than temporary shelter. They were building expectation. They were making a claim, not in the loud language of empire, but in the soft language of return. We will come back here tomorrow. And after that, and after the rains. That claim changed social life. The presence of neighbors on a repeated basis creates new habits of cooperation and new tensions as well. Labor can be shared during planting or construction. Knowledge can accumulate in common. Ceremonies begin to bind memory to particular places. The dead may be buried closer to the living, tying ancestry to the ground underfoot. Children grow up not only inside a family, but inside a small, recognizable human world, whose paths and sounds become part of them. The day inside one of those early villages would have had its own music. Before heat gathered, people would already be moving, grinding grain, carrying water, repairing baskets, checking stored food, watching children who were old enough to help and still young enough to wonder. Smoke would rise in thin columns through morning light. Dogs might circle for scraps. Someone would speak quietly about the weather, the condition of the soil, the need to clear a little more brush before planting. A village does not only create permanence, it creates repeated sound, the same voices at roughly the same hour, the same work returning with small variations. That kind of repetition matters because it is one of the true foundations of calm historical storytelling. It makes a distant world feel inhabitable, and as settlements matured, they also learned the slower arts of social balance. There were disputes to settle, obligations to remember, kin ties to honor, marriages to arrange, exchanges to manage. The village was not innocent or simple in any idealized sense. It contained friction because all human worlds do, yet it also taught endurance through proximity. People who expect to see one another again tomorrow must find ways to continue after disagreement. In that way, long before later courts developed formal diplomacy, ordinary communities were already practicing the deeper skill underneath it: coexistence over time. Language, too, thickens in such settings. Words for tools, plants, weather, kinship and ritual gather force through repetition. Over time, communities in different regions shape speech in relation to their landscapes. A people living among volcanic slopes and cooler uplands does not speak about the world in precisely the same way as one living among dense lowland forest and seasonal waterholes. Distinct voices emerge, yet the differences do not necessarily mean separation. They can also mean specialization, an expanding human conversation with varied environments. There is something beautiful in imagining that phase of life, not because it was easy, but because it was close to essentials. Smoke rising in morning air, grinding stones wearing smooth under regular use, basket fibers drying, children learning which paths to take and which insects to avoid. Stories repeated at night, the names of nearby places growing older and more layered with every generation. None of this announces itself as destiny, yet all of it forms the emotional basis of later civilization. As these villages stabilized, other things began to gather around them. Exchange widened. Useful stone moved from one region to another. Decorative materials traveled surprising distances. Objects crossed paths with ideas. A community that had learned how to remain in place was now in a better position to notice and absorb influences from elsewhere. Trade does not move only goods, it moves possibilities, and among the possibilities arriving through broader Mesoamerican contact were new ways of organizing the sacred, the ceremonial, and the political. To the west, older centers had already begun shaping powerful visual languages of authority. Traders and travelers carried more than obsidian shells or precious stone. They carried images of how a ruler could be represented, how a ceremonial center could be laid out, how a monument might tie human events to cosmic meaning. The people who would eventually become known as Maya did not simply imitate what they encountered. That is rarely how cultural strength works. They adapted, adjusted, and transformed. A borrowed idea enters a new landscape and, if it survives, becomes something else. The concept of sacred rulership, the use of signs and symbols to record events, the arrangement of communal architecture according to celestial or ritual principles. These things did not remain foreign. They were made local. They were woven into existing understandings of land, ancestry, fertility, and time. By now, the ceremonial center is beginning to draw more than obligation. It draws imagination. A child arriving there with adults may not understand the full meaning of the occasion. Yet the experience itself leaves a mark. The open plaza, the arranged approach, the smell of copal, the measured movement of older people who know what to do. The sense that this place is different from the domestic spaces of eating and sleeping. Civilization grows in part by creating memorable settings for collective feeling. Once people share awe in the same place again and again, the place acquires a power beyond its materials. This is also the point where specialists begin to matter more visibly. Not everyone keeps track of the sacred count. Not everyone knows the proper sequence of acts, the preparation of offerings, the interpretation of signs, or the right way to carve meaning into durable form. Expertise becomes socially valuable. The keeper of ritual knowledge, the carver, the planner, the observer of cycles, the organizer of labor, all of them stand a little apart. And yet their status still depends on a larger web of trust. A ceremonial order can only become stable if enough people believe that these specialists are serving something real. This period is one of the most interesting in the entire long story because it shows civilization in the act of condensing. The ingredients are present, but they have not yet hardened into their later forms. Ritual becomes more formal, construction becomes more coordinated, the distinction between ordinary domestic space and ceremonial space becomes clearer. A place where everyone lives is one thing. A place where many gather to mark the sacred is another. Once that difference begins to matter, social life changes. You can imagine the first raised platforms not only as engineering projects, but as statements. Someone had to imagine them. Someone had to persuade others that the labor was worthwhile. Someone had to organize hands, materials, timing, and purpose. The resulting space was not simply convenient. It signaled that a community saw itself as more than a collection of households. It now had a center. Centers change the imagination. They invite repetition. They attract memory. They create a sense that certain acts must happen here because this is where the world is most connected. Writing, in its earliest local forms, emerged within that widening need to fix meaning. A sign is a tool of memory, but it is also a tool of authority. Once events can be marked, commemorated, and placed in sequence, they take on another kind of weight. A lineage can become more durable, a victory, a dedication, a birth. A ritual can be attached to a symbol and carried forward. The past becomes more portable. At the same time, ritual life deepened. Ceremonies tied to agricultural cycles, fertility, rain, ancestry, and the ordering of time were no longer only intimate household acts. They increasingly belonged to shared spaces and shared calendars. The sacred was becoming structured. It still drew strength from daily life, from fields and kitchens and weather. But it also began to rise above them in visible forms: platforms, planned plazas, arranged sightlines, repeated performances. There is a temptation to describe this as the beginning of hierarchy and leave it there. But hierarchy alone does not explain why people invest labor in places that outlast them. Something more is needed. Usually, it is a shared conviction that certain acts matter for everyone. A ceremonial center can hold fear, hope, gratitude, obligation, and wonder at the same time. It can reassure people that the world is not random, that harvest and drought, birth and death, movement of sun and moon all belong to a larger order. That promise is powerful. It does not need to be perfect to be believed. Still, even as ceremonial and political forms were becoming more elaborate, survival remained rooted in much quieter forms of intelligence. Water had to be found, directed, stored, and protected. Forest had to be cleared carefully in some places and preserved in others. Wetlands could become productive if treated with respect and ingenuity. Highland slopes demanded different solutions than lowland basins. No idea of rulership could last long if the land itself was misunderstood. This is why it helps, after speaking of rituals and monuments, to return to the texture of ordinary adaptation. In some regions, communities learned to manage waterlogged ground by creating raised planting areas that improved both drainage and fertility. In others, they observed the rhythms of rain and drought so precisely that storage became almost a seasonal art. Forests were not simply cut back as obstacles. Useful trees could be preserved. Mixed planting could imitate the logic of the ecosystem while still serving human needs. Soil exhaustion was a danger, but so was forgetting that the forest itself contained a knowledge about survival. Different regions required different forms of attention, and over time that produced a world rich in local practice. The highlands asked one set of questions, the lowlands asked another. Coastal life introduced its own patterns of exchange and need. This diversity helped create the many languages that would later define the Maya-sphere. Each language held not only sound but environmental memory. It carried ways of naming rain, crops, soil, forest, kin, and sacred obligation that had been sharpened in particular places. At the level of the household, continuity often depends on small seasonal disciplines. Seeds are chosen with care, certain foods are prepared for certain days. Cloth is mended instead of discarded. Children learn when to speak formally and when to speak playfully. Offerings are assembled from ordinary materials whose meaning is anything but ordinary. These practices do not always look dramatic to an outsider, but they are the fibers of endurance. A civilization is not kept alive only by remembering its most visible achievements. It is kept alive by repeating its smaller wisdoms until they become instinct again. What is soothing about this phase of the story is that it reminds us civilization was never only an upward movement toward more. It was also an inward movement toward better fit. Communities survived because they learned the character of the places they inhabited. They listened to land. They learned how to live in relation rather than in abstraction. That is a very old kind of wisdom, and on quiet nights it can feel especially trustworthy. Out of such adaptations, some communities began to achieve a scale that would have startled their ancestors. Places in the lowlands grew from settled centers into true cities, with monumental platforms, organized labor, and a sense of collective capacity unlike anything earlier generations had known. Sites like Nakbe and later El Mirador announced that the forest could hold urban ambition on a breathtaking scale. This did not mean the jungle had been conquered in any final sense. Nothing in that region is ever mastered once and for all. But it did mean that people had learned to coordinate labor, food supply, planning, and belief over an area large enough to transform both landscape and imagination. The first sight of one of these early great centers must have been extraordinary. Rising structures where only forest had stood, massive built forms interrupting the green horizon. Broad platforms requiring countless baskets of earth or stone to be moved by hand. Routes of approach shaped by intention rather than accident. A center like that would not only inspire awe, it would change what people thought possible. When a society builds on such a scale, it begins teaching itself a new story about its own strength. Yet, even here, it is worth keeping the pace gentle. A great city is not only a monument to power, it is also a monument to organization. Fields somewhere had to support workers, water had to reach the right places, craftspeople had to develop skill, leaders had to persuade, reward, command, or ritualize labor. Carriers had to move loads beneath heat and rain. Greatness, in other words, is built from repeated ordinary efforts aligned toward a shared vision. Trade widened along with urban growth. Precious greenstone, obsidian, cacao, shells, pigments, and crafted goods moved across impressive distances. But long-distance exchange does not only enrich elites, it also braids regions together emotionally. A material from a far coast arriving in an inland center carries the whisper of another world. It suggests connection. It tells people that the horizon is larger than what they can walk in a day. These early cities were also places where time itself became more formalized. Dates were marked, events were fixed, monuments did not simply stand, they spoke, even when only a few could fully understand the language they used. The act of recording a date on stone is deeply revealing. It says this moment belongs inside a longer count. It says the present matters because it can be placed in relation to other presents and other returns. What may be most striking is that this refinement of time was never only mathematical. It was emotional and ceremonial as well. Certain days were favored for certain acts. Celestial movements were read as patterns that affected human behavior. Ritual calendars and observational systems helped communities feel that life unfolded within structure rather than randomness. For people living close to environmental uncertainty, that sense of order must have been profoundly stabilizing. If we slow ourselves enough, the beauty of it becomes almost domestic. Days are not empty, days have character. Some days invite planting, some invite dedication, some invite caution. The sky is not remote, it participates. The world is not divided cleanly into human life here and cosmic motion there. Everything is connected through cycles, and to live well is to enter them properly. That is a comforting idea, perhaps because it reduces loneliness. A person measuring seed, a priest preparing incense, a ruler dedicating a structure, an observer watching Venus, all are placed in relation to the same moving order. No wonder time became sacred. It was one of the few things that touched every level of life at once. Still, no early flowering remains untouched forever. Some of the first great centers declined. Population shifted. Major places were partly abandoned. Trade may have broken down in some areas. Environmental strain or political trouble may have played a role. The exact balance remains debated, and perhaps that uncertainty itself suits the mood of the story. Human worlds rarely collapse for one reason only. More often they fray. Systems grow too heavy, rains become less reliable, alliances fail, confidence weakens, and what once felt inevitable begins to loosen. Yet what matters most is not that certain centers quieted. It is that the ideas already shaped there did not disappear with them. Monumental architecture, ritual timekeeping, forms of rulership, writing practices, agricultural knowledge, networks of exchange, all these survived in altered ways. They moved, they receded, they waited, and when they rose again, they did so with even greater force. The world that emerged in the centuries that followed would later be remembered as the Great Classic Age, though people living through it would simply have known they were inhabiting an unusually charged present. New centers grew into power, old ideas deepened, royal courts began to present themselves as the meeting point between sky and earth. Cities multiplied, and with them came the sense that history could be not only endured but staged. It is useful here to imagine not one city but several, each distinct in personality. Tikal, rising from the lowland forest like a chain of artificial hills. Copan, brilliant in stone inscriptions and dynastic memory. Palenque, refined, intimate in its artistry, luminous with royal self-imagination. Caracol, agile in trade and regional ambition, each center belonged to a shared civilizational field. Yet, each interpreted grandeur in its own voice. Tikal is a good place to linger first. There is something almost improbable about the image of those tall pyramids rising above jungle canopy, visible from far away like declarations that human intention can indeed be seen from a distance. But what made such centers truly powerful was not height alone. It was the story they told through height. A temple did not only rise, it linked worlds. A stairway did not only lead upward, it arranged approach. Performance and reverence, space became narrative. Divine kingship reached one of its fullest expressions in this period. Rulers were not content to be practical leaders. They claimed a place inside cosmic order itself. They dressed in ways that turned the body into a moving argument for sacred authority. Headdresses, jade, feathers, textiles, ritual postures, all of it contributed to a language of legitimacy. To appear before the people was not merely to govern. It was to perform contact with powers larger than the human. At first, such claims may sound grandiose to us, yet in a society where timing, fertility, war, weather, lineage, and cosmic balance were deeply interwoven, The idea of rulership could not remain purely administrative. A ruler had to promise mediation. He or she had to stand where uncertainty pressed hardest and say, in effect, there is still order, and through proper ceremony it can be maintained. This is why classic courts often feel theatrical. Ceremony mattered because ceremony was governance. When a new structure was dedicated, when a date of major significance arrived, when a royal heir was presented or a war victory proclaimed, these were not separate acts. They were social, religious, and political performances at once. Public life was staged as cosmic reassurance. Chopin carried that logic into the realm of writing with unusual splendor. Its monuments and stairways reveal a court intensely invested in sequence, ancestry, and the durability of names. A dynasty did not simply rule, it narrated itself. To carve a lineage into stone is to insist that authority extends backward and forward through time. Ancestors authorize the living dignify the ancestors, the future is invited to witness both. There is something very human in that desire. We still want our lives placed inside stories larger than ourselves. What differs here is the elegance and confidence with which classic Maya scribes and artists turned that desire into public art. A stairway could become history, a monument could become memory, standing upright in a plaza. A glyph could hold not just sound or meaning, but prestige. Palenque offers another mood altogether. If Tikal can feel monumental and Chopin epigraphic, Palenque feels almost intimate in its sophistication. Its architecture and inscriptions suggest a court acutely aware of beauty, legitimacy, and afterlife imagination. Royal identity, they did not stop at death. It extended into transformed existence, into narratives of rebirth and divine continuity. Tomb, temple, and inscription joined to say that mortality itself could be arranged within a larger sacred drama. That is one reason classic Maya kings remain so compelling. They were not content merely to hold power, they needed power to be meaningful beyond their own lifetimes. Their monuments often feel like attempts to negotiate with oblivion. Build higher, write more precisely, align ceremony with celestial cycles, place the self inside myth. If time is sacred, perhaps rulership can survive by entering sacred time. Of course, courts were not only ceremonial theatres. They were also economic hubs. Wealth moved through them: tribute, trade goods, craft production, and labour all concentrated around centres capable of turning surplus into spectacle. Workshops flourished, artisans shaped jade, shell, ceramic and textile into objects that communicated rank, beauty, and cosmological meaning. Some goods travelled, some remained close to the court, but all of them demonstrate how deeply refined classic material culture became. There is a temptation to reserve admiration for the astronomers and rulers, yet the classic world would have been impossible without skilled workers. Someone carved each piece of jade, someone painted the vessel, someone prepared the plaster, moved the limestone, made the pigments, shaped the stucco face, trained the apprentice, corrected the line. Great art often preserves the hand of anonymity. It helps to remember that. It brings scale back into human reach. There were quieter corners of court life as well, and they deserve a little room. Not every meaningful act happened in front of a crowd. In chambers behind the great displays, scribes prepared surfaces and copied texts. Apprentices learned by watching steadier hands. Attendants sorted garments and regalia whose symbolism had to be precisely maintained. Musicians tuned instruments. Cooks prepared food not only for rulers but for the wider machinery of the household. Messengers arrived dusty from roads between allied or rival centres. Small decisions accumulated there, out of public sight, until they eventually appeared outside as policy, ceremony, or monument. Even grandeur needs back rooms, and beyond those rooms lay neighborhoods of workers whose lives rarely survive in their own words, yet whose presence is everywhere in the archaeological record. Potters repeated familiar forms while introducing subtle variation. Stone workers knew the temperament of local materials. Carriers lifted loads into projects whose scale no one person could claim. Farmers on the edges of the city, and often far beyond it, supported the entire concentration of craft and ceremony by producing the food without which no court could glitter for long. To think of the classic age only as royal theatre is to miss half its reality. It was also a gigantic act of coordination among people who may never have stood at the centre of a plaza, and yet made the plaza possible. This is part of what gives the classic world its emotional complexity. It was beautiful, inventive, and disciplined, but it was also demanding. The court promised order, and in exchange it drew labour and loyalty into itself. For some, that may have brought prestige, opportunity, or protection. For others, it may have felt burdensome, even if the system as a whole seemed natural. Human societies are rarely only one thing. The same city that inspires wonder in an observer can feel heavy to the one carrying limestone up its rising flank. The ball game belongs to this world as well, and it is worth treating carefully. In later fantasy, it can become only brutality. In lived reality, it was much more layered. Courts were formal spaces where movement, sound, competition, and sacred symbolism met. The game drew meaning from mythic struggle, from the movement of celestial bodies, from ideas of death and renewal, from political display. To watch a game in a classic centre would have been to watch more than sport. It would have felt like a controlled reenactment of deep patterns built into the world. Music would have helped bind these spaces together too. We do not always remember sound when imagining ancient architecture, but plazas and courts are made for acoustics as much as for sight. Drums, shell trumpets, rattles, flutes, chanting, formal speech, the patterned noise of gathering bodies, all of it would have given ceremonial life a pulse. Sound reaches people who cannot see clearly from the edge of a crowd. It organizes emotion. It announces transitions. It helps memory adhere to place. These were not silent ruins at their height. They were resonant environments. One can even imagine the contrast between public sound and private stillness. The plaza emptied after a great event. Torches dimmed. A few attendants remained. Somewhere nearby, food was being cleaned up. Garments folded, instruments set aside. The same court that had hosted divine theatre now returned to the practical afterlife of every performance, sweeping, sorting, resting, beginning again. That rhythm between intensity and recovery would have been familiar to everyone from rulers to servants, rising and settling, never staying too long in one register. Another important correction to older simplifications is the role of women. The classic Maya world was not devoid of female authority. Royal women could act as regents, diplomats, dynastic anchors, ritual participants, and sometimes rulers of remarkable force. Marriage tied cities together, maternal lineage could matter, court politics did not move solely. Through men, this too softens the world into a more believable complexity. What perhaps makes the classic age especially powerful in a bedtime telling is that so much of it was about arrangement. The arrangement of bodies in ceremony, the arrangement of buildings around plazas, the arrangement of names inside dynastic sequence, the arrangement of time into calendars that linked earthly life to celestial motion. Even conflict, as we will soon see, was arranged. For now, though, let us remain with the calmer side of this achievement, a civilization trying very hard to place itself inside order. And nowhere is that effort clearer than in the quiet brilliance of Maya astronomy and mathematics. It is easy to praise an ancient people for building high, because height is visible. It takes more patience to admire what they understood. Yet some of the most remarkable work done in the Maya world happened not in open plazas, but in the disciplined movement of thought. Observers watched the heavens across generations. Scribes and specialists compared cycles, corrected counts, and refined systems capable of tracking more than a single year at a time. The sky was not a backdrop, it was an active text. Night observation itself must have shaped a particular kind of mind. To watch the sky repeatedly from the same place over many years is to become intimate with recurrence. One learns not only what happens but how it returns. A bright object appears, vanishes, and appears again. The moon fattens and thins. Certain stars rise where they always rise. Yet the year surrounding them has subtly changed. Such work disciplines attention. It asks for patience, humility, and a willingness to let meaning emerge gradually. Those are also the qualities that make this world so easy to enter at bedtime. Its deepest achievements were born from long looking. There is also a social tenderness beneath the prestige of astronomy. The observer rarely works for himself alone. He works so that others may plant with more confidence. Celebrate at the proper interval, orient memory, or feel that the human world still aligns with something beyond its own confusion. In that sense, counting the sky is a form of care. It serves order, but it also serves reassurance. A community that knows someone is keeping the count can rest a little more easily inside uncertainty. Venus, the moon, the sun, eclipses, seasonal turns, intervals between appearances, all of these mattered. To notice them required more than curiosity, it required continuity. A single lifetime cannot build a sophisticated observational tradition without inheritance. Someone has to pass on method, someone has to trust that keeping count will matter decades later. That too is a form of civilizational faith. Among the most celebrated achievements of the Maya intellectual world was the development of positional notation and the independent use of zero as a mathematical concept. Even now, that can sound abstract if stated too bluntly. But think of what it means in lived terms. It means a people had learned to mark absence as something meaningful. It means a count could be structured in ways that allowed very large numbers to be handled elegantly. It means the calendar could move across enormous stretches of time with both precision and grace. There is a strange calm in that. Zero is often described as an innovation of pure logic, yet it can also feel almost philosophical. A place held by nothing still matters, an empty position has significance, a gap carries order for a culture so deeply concerned with cycles. Recurrence and the relation between seen and unseen, such a concept feels especially resonant. Astronomy and mathematics did not float above society. They were woven into ritual, agriculture, legitimacy, and memory. A ceremony had force partly because it occurred at the right time. A ruler looked more convincing when action aligned with celestial expectation. Farmers benefited when seasonal knowledge was reliable. Priests and keepers of calendars served communities not only by predicting but by reassuring. The sky was measurable, and therefore the world was, at least in part, livable. Imagine the emotional effect of that on ordinary people. To know that there were specialists who could read cycles, who could say when a date was auspicious or when a return was expected, would have softened some part of uncertainty. not eliminated it, of course. Drought still threatened. Illness still came, crops still failed. But where modern people often turn to clocks and forecasts, ancient communities turned toward counts that bound present time to ancestral observation. That is a profound form of trust, and yet the very systems that stabilized life also gave structure to rivalry. The classic world was full of magnificence, but magnificence has neighbors. Power attracts competition. Courts that stage themselves as the center of order rarely accept equal claimants without tension. In the Maize, this tension would eventually be shaped into one of the strangest and most elegant forms of political conflict anywhere in the ancient world. War, when it sharpened among major centers, was not imagined as random violence. It could be synchronized with cosmic patterns. Venus mattered, celestial timing mattered. Monumental accounts of conflict did not present battles as merely strategic events. They framed them as moments in which earthly struggle unfolded beneath or within the logic of the heavens. This did not make war gentle, but it did make it legible in a specifically Maya way. When we step into that phase of the story, it is important not to let the tone harden too much. The point is not to hear clashing metal or galloping cavalry. The point is to understand a world in which diplomacy, astronomy, marriage, propaganda, and force were all intertwined. Alliances were woven through kinship. Royal daughters moved between courts. Vassal cities watched the balance of power shift and adapted carefully. A monument after a victory did not merely record success. It translated it into cosmic language. One can almost picture rival capitals studying one another with patience more than fury. Who has married whom? Which smaller center is wavering? Which date is favorable? Which observer has marked a coming celestial event? Which old grievance can be reopened? Which tributary network is growing too strong? Power at this level often moves most decisively before the battle begins. The idea, sometimes called Star War, reflects that peculiar marriage of calculation and conflict. A confrontation could be framed as divinely timed, sanctioned by celestial cycles. Written not only into military ambition, but into a worldview where planets themselves seem to participate in political reality. To win under such conditions was to do more than defeat an enemy. It was to claim that the sky leaned in your favor, for the smaller centers tied to more powerful neighbors. This world of celestial politics required a constant emotional balancing act. A local ruler might honor an overlord publicly, while privately watching for signs of weakness. Marriage alliances could create loyalty in one generation and impossible tension in the next. Tribute was not only economic, it was psychological. It reminded a lesser city every year, every ceremony, every shipment, that autonomy had limits. Yet limits are rarely accepted forever in quiet courtyards far from the grandest capitals. Ambitions were certainly growing, grievances certainly hardening, calculations certainly being made. This helps explain why the political map could never remain still. No alliance was permanent, because no relationship was free from memory, opportunity, or fear. A city wounded by past humiliation might wait decades for a favorable moment. Another might survive by shifting allegiance with exquisite timing. Royal women, so often reduced to names in marriage lists, were among the most important carriers of these transitions. They moved between worlds, linking bloodlines, carrying expectations, translating interests, and sometimes quietly deciding the atmosphere in which future political decisions would ripen. Propaganda, therefore, mattered enormously. The same event would be narrated differently in different places. A captured ruler became proof of one dynasty's favor and another's failure. Allied cities repeated motifs that reinforced common purpose. Visual language traveled. Symbols of authority could be standardized across a network, turning scattered centers into an ideological field. Marriage diplomacy added still more complexity. A princess sent into another court did not cease to belong to her place of origin. She could carry memory, influence, and strategic value with her. Children born of such unions might later embody competing claims. Kingship could bind cities together or make succession more delicate. There is something almost dreamlike in how much rested on both bloodline and timing. For ordinary people, the high politics of rival courts were probably felt most clearly through consequences: redirected tribute, military obligations, labor demands, shifting safety along roads, instability in local leadership. This is why it makes sense to leave the glitter of royal narratives before they grow too exhausting. Their splendor can be hypnotic, but it can also tire the mind if it lingers too long. So, after considering the courts and their celestial wars, it helps to come down again. Return to the road, return to the market, return to a field at the edge of a settlement. Imagine what it means when long-distance trade becomes less reliable, when a fortified posture replaces confidence, when rulers invest more in conflict than in reassurance. The pressure shows first in ordinary places. A road that once carried obsidian, salt, cacao, cloth, or crafted goods now feels less certain. A smaller allied centre watches its loyalties with fear. A household measures the burden of new obligations. A parent wonders whether nearby authority still protects or merely extracts. The mythology of power is always tested in such moments. If the heavens still move properly, but daily life grows harder, faith in mediation begins to thin. This thinning rarely happens all at once. Cities do not awaken one morning and discover they are broken. Instead, strain accumulates, population grows, forests are cleared more aggressively. Soil weakens, watersheds become less stable, reservoirs demand more maintenance, rainfall patterns grow unreliable. Rivalry intensifies, defensive works appear where openness once signaled confidence. Courts continue to stage legitimacy, but the underlying systems that made magnificence possible begin to lose resilience. If you picture a family living through that era of strain, the collapse becomes easier to understand in human terms. First, perhaps the rains are less dependable than they once seemed. Then a stored supply does not stretch far enough. Then news arrives that a road is unsafe, or a nearby centre has changed allegiance. Labour demands increase just when household effort is already needed elsewhere. Ceremonies continue, but with a different mood. People still gather, yet they do not gather with the same confidence. A ruler still appears in regalia, yet more faces in the crowd have begun to wonder privately whether ceremony alone can restore what is slipping away. Departure, when it comes, is often a domestic act rather than a dramatic one. One family leaves because relatives elsewhere may be able to help. Another stays one more season, and then follows. A house is not always abandoned in panic. Sometimes it is abandoned with sadness and practicality. Useful objects are taken if possible. Others are left behind because carrying them is too costly. A courtyard that held generations of conversation becomes only an empty arrangement of walls and floor. Leaves gather, rain enters, lizards begin using the cracks. The city, from a distance, still appears to stand. Up close, it has already started becoming memory. There is also a quieter emotional cost to political spectacle. When a society places tremendous symbolic weight on rulers, any visible failure acquires a depth that spreads far beyond policy. Crops are not only poor, they feel ominous. A defeat is not only strategic, it feels cosmically embarrassing. The more thoroughly public life is tied to sacred performance, the more exhausting it becomes when performance can no longer reassure. That fatigue is part of what made the classic crisis so intimate as well as institutional. The most poignant part of the classic collapse is that it was not really a collapse of talent. The people did not suddenly become less intelligent. Their astronomy did not become less subtle overnight. Their architecture did not cease to matter because it lacked beauty. Rather, the social and ecological conditions required to sustain very large lowland courts came under increasing stress, and multiple stresses reinforced one another. Deforestation is one of the quiet villains in this story. Trees regulate moisture, stabilize soil, and shape local climate in ways that are easy to underestimate until they are compromised. Clear too much land, too quickly, in a fragile environment, and the consequences arrive unevenly, but surely. Sediment moves, water behaves differently. Dry seasons lengthen in felt intensity. Floods can damage as much as drought. Agricultural systems that had worked while balance held begin to show signs of fatigue. Now add conflict, add interrupted exchange networks, add rulers whose legitimacy depends on maintaining visible order. Add the need to feed concentrated populations, add the possibility that people, seeing repeated failure, begin to question whether the court still serves a necessary function. At some sites, monument production slows. At others, dated inscriptions cease. The silence of the stone is one of the most haunting clues in all of ancient American history. When the count stops being carved, something deep has shifted. And still, even here, the story is softer than sudden catastrophe. Great centers emptied gradually. Some retained smaller populations for a time. Caretakers may have continued rituals long after the political brilliance of a place had faded. Families left in stages, buildings weathered, plazas that once staged mass reassurance grew quieter year by year. Vines advanced, rooms filled with fallen plaster, leaves and nesting creatures. What had been an urban world slowly became a remembered one. There is melancholy in this, but not only melancholy. There is also humility. A city can be astonishing and still be temporary. Knowledge can be immense and still be vulnerable to ecological strain. Rulers can speak with divine confidence and still fail to command rainfall. Political cohesion or recovery. The classic lowland world did not end because it lacked brilliance. It ended because brilliance does not free anyone from material limits. Yet even then, the Maya story does not close. It changes region. It changes political form. It changes the balance between court, market, trade, and community. As the great southern centers grew quiet, the north was already becoming something else. The northern peninsula offered different conditions and therefore different possibilities. Water behaved differently there, often hidden underground, emerging through sinkholes and cenotes rather than through large surface rivers. Maritime routes mattered more, contact widened in other directions. The societies that flourished in this phase would draw from older Maya traditions while also absorbing ideas and influences from farther afield. If the classic courts had embodied one answer to how a civilization should organize itself, the post-classic North would offer another. Chichen Itza is the best known of these northern experiments, and in many ways it deserves the attention. Not because it simply inherited greatness, but because it reinvented it. Here, architecture becomes both spectacle and calculation in a fresh way. A pyramid can serve as ceremonial monument and cosmic device. A ball court can be made not only imposing, but acoustically uncanny. Columns, platforms, temples and reliefs suggest a world less centered, on a single divine king, and more open to layered sources of authority, trade, and collective ritual identity. The famous pyramid, often discussed in relation to shadow and serpent imagery, shows how intensely theatrical northern architecture could be without losing mathematical care. Light itself was recruited into meaning. There is something quietly astonishing in that idea. A civilization watched the sky so patiently that buildings could be made to converse with it. Synods gave northern religious life a different feel from the southern world of reservoir management and lowland forest capitals. Water, emerging from deep limestone chambers, invites a different spiritual imagination. Offerings cast downward rather than lifted upward, pilgrimage shaped by descent as much as ascent. The earth itself becomes an opening. This kind of sacred geography can feel especially dreamlike at night, perhaps because it reminds us that not all depth is hidden by darkness. Some of it is revealed there. Some northern systems, especially in and around confederated centers, show us how political wisdom can survive disappointment. If concentrated divine kingship had proven vulnerable in one age, later communities experimented with broader sharing of authority. Merchant influence, noble councils, regional agreements, and negotiated tribute made for a messier order perhaps, but also a more resilient one. Stability did not require everyone to agree completely. It required enough institutions to keep disagreement from becoming immediate ruin. That kind of arrangement can sound less glamorous than a towering dynasty, yet it may be one of the most practically intelligent developments in the long Maya story. Human beings rarely get to choose between beauty and endurance so cleanly. Often, they must redesign beauty to make endurance possible. The northern world did exactly that. Maritime trade expanded the reach of northern centers. Large canoes moved goods along coasts and between regions, tying the peninsula into broader commercial worlds. Salt, cotton, cacao, crafted goods, feathers, metals in later phases. All of these contributed to economies less dependent on the exact same structures that had supported classic southern courts. Markets matter more in such a world. Merchant families matter more. Flexibility matters more. This is one reason the post-classic phase should not be told as decline. It is better understood as adaptation. Political authority could be more distributed. Councils and networks might matter alongside hereditary status. Regional confederations, including later Mayapan, demonstrate that Maya civilization retained the ability to reorganize itself after major disruption. The form changed, but the underlying cultural capacity remained. That is a comforting pattern to notice. Human beings often survive not by preserving an old system intact, but by carrying forward enough memory to build another one. Ritual persists, though perhaps in modified form. Trade persists, though with different roots. Writing continues, though sometimes in more practical modes. Pilgrimage continues, calendar knowledge continues, life continues. Daily life in the northern world carried a somewhat different texture from that of the old southern capitals. In a trading center, one might hear more languages and accents moving through market space. Salt, cloth, cacao, worked stone, feathers, and imported curiosities would pass from hand to hand with a practical energy less tied to a single courtly display. Merchant households could gain influence not by staging divine singularity, but by sustaining networks. The marketplace itself became a kind of civic heartbeat, a place where information traveled along with goods. Architecture mirrored this shift. The eye still found beauty, geometry, and ceremonial power, but there was often a greater sense of distributed life. One could imagine delegates, merchants, ritual specialists, craftspeople, and local leaders moving through the same broader system without all authority collapsing into one sacred body. It is a different mood from the classic lowlands, not less intelligent, not less sophisticated, simply organized around another answer to the question of endurance. The North, then, becomes a place of renewal after strain. The mood changes, not everything is healed, internal tensions remain, competition does not vanish. But the civilizational field is still alive, still inventive, still capable of making beautiful and meaningful worlds. And that living capacity is precisely what would make the arrival of Europeans so consequential. They did not meet a ghost, they met societies very much in motion. The first contacts were uncertain and human before they were fully imperial. Shipwreck, hunger, misunderstanding, survival among strangers, the slow accumulation of knowledge about one another. Such beginnings matter because they remind us that conquest did not descend all at once as an abstract force. It entered through bodies, wounded sailors, coastal communities, translators, captives, negotiators, opportunists, resistors. Two early Spaniards, whose lives diverged dramatically, offer a powerful image of the ambiguity of first contact. One remained oriented toward the world he came from, preserving enough distance to become a translator and intermediary. Another crossed the threshold more fully, marrying into local society, fighting alongside indigenous people, and refusing any easy return. Even at the point of first encounter, the lines were not perfectly simple. Worlds met, but people still made choices inside that meeting. Disease, however, moved with a cruelty that choice could not easily answer. Smallpox and other old world illnesses spread ahead of or alongside direct military domination, and their effects were devastating. Communities that had endured drought, political fracture, and ecological strain now faced biological catastrophe on a different scale. The numbers remain difficult to hold calmly, yet the broader truth is clear enough. Sickness altered the balance of the continent before many battles were ever decided. Spanish campaigns in Maya regions were not uniformly swift or glorious. Dense forests, heat, fragmented terrain, local military skill, and determined resistance made conquest uneven and prolonged. Expeditions failed, settlements were abandoned, supply lines became fragile. Some communities calculated alliance, others resisted stubbornly. Some regions remained outside effective Spanish control for generations. In the far Payton, independent Maya, rule survived astonishingly late. This is important because popular memory sometimes treats conquest as immediate inevitability. It was not. It was a drawn-out contest in which indigenous communities used diplomacy, mobility, local knowledge, adaptation, and persistence wherever they could. Yet over time, disease, repeated campaigns, colonial settlement, and the exploitation of internal divisions made resistance harder to sustain. Resistance also took forms subtler than open battle. Some communities learned how to appear compliant while preserving internal leadership. Others slowed tribute, shifted settlement patterns, or used difficult terrain to keep colonial reach. Shallow knowledge of roads, wetlands, forests, and seasonal movement remained a major advantage. A foreign army may arrive with steel and horses, yet still be made helpless by heat, distance, hunger, and the inability to read a landscape that local people had known for generations. Even where Spanish towns and missions were established, indigenous responses varied from household to household. One family might accept baptism while still maintaining old ritual obligations in private. Another might enter colonial service for pragmatic reasons. Another might flee deeper inland. Another might use new legal tools to defend old rights. There is comfort, Oddly enough, in remembering that no conquered people ever becomes a single thing. Life continues in plural. The sorrow of the colonial transition lies not only in military defeat, it lies in the attempted reordering of reality. Religion was targeted, books were burned, objects were destroyed, sacred practices were denounced, communities were reorganized, tribute and labor systems extracted value while claiming moral purpose. A conquering power rarely contents itself with outer control. It wants inner redefinition, yet inner life is also where survival becomes most difficult to extinguish. Even under colonial pressure, festival remained one of the most powerful vessels of continuity. A feast day might now bear the name of a saint, and yet beneath that name older relationships still moved. Gratitude for rain, petition for fertility, honor to place, reverence for ancestors, communal reformation through shared food and music. Outsiders often mistake adaptation for surrender. In fact, adaptation can be one of the cleverest forms of memory. Change the outer garment if necessary, but keep the inner pattern intact. Land itself helped preserve this pattern. Mountains, caves, springs, groves, and old ceremonial grounds are difficult to erase completely because they do not depend on official approval to remain meaningful. People return to them, sometimes openly, sometimes discreetly. A sacred geography can survive legal conquest by being remembered in footsteps. That is why place matters so deeply in this history. A people can be pressured away from institutions more easily than from remembered landscapes. Books could be burned, but memory found other hiding places. Ritual could be suppressed publicly, but continue in altered forms, in caves, in household patterns, in feast days given new names, in saints identified with older powers, in offerings whose meanings remained layered. Language could be pushed aside in formal settings, yet remain alive in kitchens, fields, market speech, lullabies, and prayer. One of the quiet triumphs of Maya survival is precisely this shift from visible court culture to embedded communal culture. When great capitals weaken, continuity moves elsewhere. It moves into local leadership, into kinship, into land memory, into healing traditions, into craft, into the timing of planting, into stories recited at night. It becomes less spectacular and more durable. Colonial rule was harsh, extractive, and often cruelly destructive, but it never achieved complete cultural replacement. Indigenous communities learned to use colonial courts when useful, to defend land claims, to document history in new scripts, to preserve fragments that later generations could expand into fuller memory. Some books survived because they were hidden, others survived because traditions were translated into alphabetic writing. Some survived because practices were simply kept alive long enough that no document was needed to justify them. This phase of the story is especially suited to a calm, humane telling because it reveals the true scale of resilience. It is easy to admire a pyramid. It takes a different kind of attention to admire a grandmother who keeps a language alive, a healer who remembers which plants matter, a community that adapts a ceremony without surrendering its old heart, a local scribe who records lineage and land so descendants will have evidence later. Quiet endurance rarely receives the monuments it deserves. Women often stood at the center of that continuity. They transmitted language in daily speech, maintained food traditions, carried textile knowledge, organized household ritual, and kept kin relations active across difficult circumstances. In many societies, what appears public in history books is only the crest of a much larger private labor of preservation. A child's sense of who they are is rarely formed first in a plaza. It is formed through repeated intimate contact, through food, clothing, correction, affection, prayer, and story. In that sense, generations of women helped hold the Maya world together in ways that monumental history can only partly reveal. The same is true of healers and agricultural keepers. Colonial authorities might dismiss local knowledge as superstition or habit, yet communities continued relying on specialists who knew how to interpret illness, season, plant use, and ritual timing. These forms of knowledge were not frozen relics. They adapted, they incorporated what was useful, discarded what no longer fit, and endured because they worked well enough to remain trusted. Survival is often conservative in one sense and inventive in another. Over the centuries, the Maya world continued to change under colonial and then national regimes. There were uprisings, negotiations, new forms of identity, new forms of discrimination, and renewed struggles for land and political voice. Yet, the central fact remained: the people had not vanished, their presence persisted across Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, Honduras, and beyond, each region carrying its own local histories, languages, and balances between preservation and change. In some places, weaving traditions became a visible thread of continuity, patterns holding memory. In cloth, the way inscriptions once held it in stone. In others, market culture preserved both economic life and social knowledge. Traditional calendars retained meaning for ritual specialists and community elders. Agricultural practices adapted but did not wholly sever from ancestral logic. Ceremonial life absorbed Christian forms while quietly maintaining older relationships to mountain, water, ancestors, and time. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, indigenous activism has added another layer to this long continuity. Teachers, writers, community historians, linguists, artists, and local leaders have worked to make ancestral knowledge visible without flattening it into folklore. Some defend land rights, some record oral traditions, some build bilingual education, some challenge states that once preferred indigenous cultures only as symbols of the distant past. This work may not look like the raising of a pyramid, yet it belongs to the same deep story of making memory durable. There is special beauty in the fact that modern revival often involves both elders and youth. One generation carries experience and ceremonial depth. Another brings energy, literacy in multiple systems, digital fluency, and the ability to speak across institutional worlds. When these generations cooperate, tradition does not merely survive. It acquires new pathways. An old language enters a classroom, a radio station, a phone screen, a legal document, a song recorded for listeners far away. Continuity stretches without snapping. The modern world, with all its pressures, has not ended this inheritance either. Schools, radios, roads, migration, nationalism, tourism, digital media, environmental threat, legal activism, all have altered the field. Some changes have endangered tradition, others have unexpectedly helped preserve it. A language can now disappear faster under pressure, but it can also be recorded, taught, shared, and revitalized through tools unimaginable in earlier centuries. Young people may leave ancestral communities for work or study, yet still carry home in speech, dress, music, politics, and ritual participation. In the present, one of the most moving developments is the way older continuity and new tools sometimes meet. A language once transmitted only through speech can now be recorded, taught in community schools, shared in digital archives, written in messages sent across borders. A weaving tradition can appear in ceremonial use, daily life, and contemporary art at once. Young professionals may study law, medicine, or engineering, while also serving as translators of ancestral worlds into national and international conversation. Continuity no longer depends solely on isolation. It can also depend on skilled participation. There are challenges in this. Of course, tourism can simplify living cultures into decorative backdrops. Political recognition can arrive with conditions. Economic pressure can pull young people away from local practice even as education equips them to defend it. Climate change threatens traditional agriculture while also making indigenous ecological knowledge newly relevant to global discussions. The future is not easy, but the long history behind these communities has prepared them for complexity. Adaptation is not new to them. It is one of the oldest habits they possess. In many modern communities, ceremony still offers that old balance between continuity and adaptation. People may travel by bus instead of on foot, use microphones instead of only the naked voice, record an event on phones that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors, and yet the deeper purpose remains recognizable. A community gathers not merely to preserve an old image of itself, but to refresh its relationships in the present. Tradition, at its healthiest, is not a costume for the past. It is a method for carrying meaning forward. There is something moving about the present phase of the story because it refuses the tidy categories outsiders often prefer. The Maya are not only ancient or only modern, they are not only archaeological subjects or only political actors. They are living communities with layered identities, carrying an inheritance neither frozen nor dissolved. Their history is not a museum room, it is a continuing negotiation with the future. If we return now to the quiet with which we began, the overall shape of the journey becomes clearer. A seed becomes settlement, settlement becomes ceremonial world becomes city, city becomes court, calendar, inscription, and mathematical brilliance. Power expands, strains, competes, and sometimes tears itself thin. Ecological pressure deepens, great capitals fade, new regional orders emerge. Foreign conquest wounds, but does not erase. Survival moves inward. Continuity survives in forms too ordinary to impress a conqueror and too stubborn to disappear. That last point may be the deepest one. History often teaches us to look for survival in spectacular victories. The Maya story suggests another possibility. Sometimes a culture survives because it keeps enough of itself alive in daily practice to outlast every phase that tries to finish it. The language spoken to a child, the pattern woven into cloth, the right day chosen for a ceremony, the memory of a medicinal plant, the path to a sacred place, the old way of understanding rain, the willingness to say that the past is not over because the people who carry it are not over. And so, by the time we reach the present, the forest at the beginning looks different. The stone monuments are still there. Yes, they remain beautiful. They remain astonishing. But they no longer stand as lonely witnesses to a world that disappeared. They stand as one layer in a much longer continuity. The real monument is distributed. It lives in villages and cities, in market stalls, classrooms, kitchens, hillside fields, local councils, festivals, woven hippials, recorded songs, legal struggles, whispered prayers, and calendars still consulted with care. If you imagine a child somewhere in the Maya world falling asleep after hearing words that were once spoken centuries ago in other forms, you are already near the true ending. Not a sealed ending, not a lid placed on the story, just a soft understanding that the count goes on. Days continue being marked, fires are still lit, seeds are still saved, water is still watched, cloth is still woven, ceremonies are still adapted and repeated. The old knowledge, even when interrupted, still finds hands. Perhaps that is why this long journey offers a rare kind of reassurance. It tells us that not everything enduring needs to remain unchanged. Some things last precisely because they know how to bend, pause, hide, return, and take root again in altered ground. The Maya world has done that many times. It has been village and city, court and confederation, visible ceremony and quiet household practice, monumental inscription and spoken memory. In every form, some essential thread continued, and when sleep begins to blur the edges of all these centuries together, that may be the best thought to keep. Not the exact year of a ruler's accession, or the height of a temple, or the sequence of foreign campaigns, but the gentler truth beneath them all. People kept carrying what mattered. They carried it through weather, through migration, through grief, through pressure, through translation, through silence. They carried it until morning was possible again, and perhaps that is the best way to leave this history. Not at the height of a temple, not in the smoke of battle, not in the shock of conquest, but in the gentle continuity of ordinary life. Somewhere before dawn, someone will rise and prepare food. Somewhere, a language older than many nations will be spoken casually, without performance, because it belongs to the morning. Somewhere, a mountain, a cenote, a field, or a church built over older sacred ground will still hold layered meanings at once. Somewhere, the long memory of maize and rain and counted days will continue moving through another generation. The great cities taught the sky to speak through stone. The scholars of old placed astonishing care into the motion of numbers. The rulers staged power against eternity and lost, as all rulers eventually do. But the people endured in quieter ways. They endured by remaining in relation. To land, to one another, to ritual, to speech, to the slow discipline of remembering enough. So, as the night deepens and the forest of the imagination grows darker and softer, let the final image be a modest one. Not a conquering king, not a blazing temple, a household light, a woven garment folded for tomorrow. A bowl set out, seeds stored, a voice speaking in a language that has crossed centuries. Beyond the house, old stones cooling under leaves, above them, stars moving in their patient order. And between earth and sky, the count still continuing, not loudly, not triumphantly, just faithfully, the way the most durable things often do. Perhaps that is why the old monuments remain so affecting, even after you understand that the people were never gone. They are no longer evidence of a vanished mystery. They become anchors of perspective. They remind the present of its depth. They remind anyone listening tonight that human time is wider than political fashion, wider than conquest narratives, wider even than ruin. Stone can hold that lesson, but so can a living voice. The story does not close, it grows quieter. It passes from monument to memory, from memory to speech, from speech to sleep, and from sleep into morning again.